There's a silent empire in Europe, unseen, unwritten, but everywhere. It doesn't show on old maps. It left behind no monuments. Yet it conquered forests, mountains, and entire bloodlines. Not with swords, but with inheritance. It lives in the cells of over 300 million people today. And it's traced back to one ancient father, born thousands of years ago in the wind-swept grasslands near the Dnieper. His legacy is not a kingdom, but a mutation. A single change on the Y chromosome that now defines the Slavic world. That mutation is called R1A. But how did one man's genetic shadow stretch across half of Europe? Slavic men today, especially in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, carry this haplogroup at an intensity that shocks geneticists. Over 60% of them share this ancient signal. In some places, it's even higher. That's not cultural coincidence. That's a biological explosion. A founder effect so massive it reshaped an entire population's future. And what about the rest of Europe? France, Britain, Italy? R1A barely whispers there. Just 5%. Maybe 10% in rare corners. So why did the Slavic world become its stronghold? To answer that, we go back further, before there were Slavs, before there were languages, before the idea of Europe itself. Out on the Eurasian steppe, long before Rome rose, horse-riding tribes known as Proto-Indo-Europeans began moving, fast, far, and with fire. Among them, one male line began to flourish, R1A Z645, and eventually R1A M417, the ancestor of today's Slavic signature. These men rode into history like thunder, and left their imprint everywhere they went. But in Eastern Europe, something different happened. Instead of vanishing into the gene pools of conquered lands, R1A took root. It thrived. It waited. Centuries passed. Cultures rose and fell. Then, around 500 CE, it began again. From the river valleys of modern-day Ukraine and Belarus, a nameless people surged outward. They had no unified state, no royal banners, only shared language, customs, and genes. These were the early Slavs. And their expansion wasn't a trickle. It was a tidal wave. They moved west into the lands of Celts and Germans, south into the Balkans, north into the forests of the Rus. Every step they took left a genetic footprint, and everywhere they settled, R1A multiplied, not slowly, rapidly, like a lineage reborn. Today, when we dig into Iron Age graves in Poland, we find R1A M458, the so-called Polish clade, already rooted deep in local DNA. That's not just continuity. That's ancestral defiance. These weren't invaders borrowing bloodlines. They were locals becoming legends. Among East Slavs, we find another R1A subclade, Z282, blanketing the gene pool like frost over Earth. And it's not random. It's proof of something massive, that a small founding population, perhaps just a few thousand men, seeded a genetic empire that would stretch from the Vistula to the Volga. And in this empire, there were no walls, just blood. Even among South Slavs, in the tangled ethnic tapestry of the Balkans, the signature is still there. Though mingled now with Balkan haplogroups like I2ADN and EV13, R1A remains, quiet but unmoved. It tells us that the Slavs didn't erase the people they met. They merged. They absorbed. And their lineage endured. But this story isn't just genetic. It's deeply human. Because when you carry the same Y chromosome as millions of other men, when that code passes untouched from father to son across centuries, it's no longer just biology. It becomes a memory, a link to someone who lived before your people had a name, before borders, before books, before belief systems. And still today, with all our science, we can't tell you his name, only his fingerprint. R1A is that fingerprint, not of a king, not of a warrior, but of a man whose children never stopped walking. Long before the word Slav ever echoed across the valleys of Eastern Europe, there was silence. Not the kind you hear, but the kind etched into empty land. Across the vast grasslands stretching from the Black Sea to the Ural Mountains, no city stood, no chronicles were written. But something was stirring, something older than myth, older than empire. A people were taking shape, not through culture, but through code. This is where the Slavic story truly begins, not in medieval chronicles, but in the wind-swept steppe, where a powerful ancestral pulse first entered the human genome. The men who lived here, some 5,000 years ago, weren't called Slavs. They spoke a language we'll never hear again, but they carried something that would shape civilizations to come. In their blood flowed the earliest strands of our 1A, and in their bones lay the blueprints of Indo-European destiny. They were part of the Yamnaya culture, nomadic herders who buried their dead in deep mounds and measured their wealth in cattle, not coin. But they had something no one else had at the time: horses, wheels, and fire in their lungs. They moved fast, they moved far, and they left behind a genetic explosion that would shatter the old world. The Yamnaya didn't just migrate, they transformed, and in doing so, they passed their blood forward to future warriors, kings, farmers, poets, and Slavs. Genetic studies show that modern Slavic populations still carry this steppe ancestry in overwhelming doses. Among Russians, Ukrainians, and Poles, up to 50% of their DNA traces back to those Bronze Age riders. And it's not just paternal. Autosomal DNA, the sum of one's ancestry, reveals a cocktail rich in Yamnaya, balanced by Western hunter-gatherers, and sprinkled with Siberian-like elements that hint at ancient contacts to the east. But the journey from Yamnaya to Slavic wasn't direct. After the great expansion of the Indo-Europeans, their descendants began to fragment. Cultures emerged, hybridized, disappeared. In the borderlands between forest and steppe, two new archaeological cultures took root: the Zarabintsy and Cherniakov complexes. These were the crucibles. The ancestors of the Slavs weren't just herders anymore. They farmed, forged, and traded. They mixed with Balts, Scythians, and perhaps even early Germanic peoples. And through it all, the Indo-European fire burned on, in their language, in their rituals, and most invisibly, in their genes. The evolution of our 1A subclades mirrors this transformation. The ancient root diversified into branches like Z282, M458, and CTS1211, each carving out a future Slavic identity before that identity even had a name. These mutations didn't spread because of conquest alone. They spread because of survival, cohesion, and the unforgiving pressure of time. In some regions, like central Ukraine and southern Belarus, these genetic signatures remained astonishingly stable. Through climate shifts, tribal wars, and foreign incursions, the steppe imprint never faded. It's as if the land itself remembered who it belonged to. Even when populations moved, the signal stayed. And yet, there's a paradox. While the early Indo-Europeans are often romanticized as warriors on horseback, their true gift to the Slavs wasn't violence, it was resilience. Their legacy isn't measured in swords, but in shared lineages, a kind of biological continuity that, against all odds, remained intact through millennia of chaos. Even today, when scientists examine Slavic DNA, they're struck by its anchoring in the East. Compared to Western Europeans, whose genomes reflect more Neolithic farmer ancestry and different Y-DNA haplogroups, the Slavs remain tethered to that original Indo-European source. In fact, the farther east you go, the closer you get to the original pulse. In northern Russia, echoes of Siberian tribes mingle with steppe ancestry. In Ukraine, the Yamnaya signal still burns hot. But what makes it truly remarkable is this: despite centuries of migrations, wars, and political shifts, the Slavic genome remembers where it came from. In the code of each cell lies a quiet loyalty to ancestors who never built a city, never wrote a book, never crowned a king, but changed the course of human genetics forever. No one saw them coming. There were no royal armies, no monumental cities, no declarations of war. And yet, within barely 2 centuries, they redrew the genetic map of an entire continent. They didn't need bronze to dominate. They carried something far more powerful: numbers and time. It was the 6th century CE. Across Europe, chaos reigned. Rome had fallen. Gothic and Germanic tribes battled for land. Empires shrank into memory. And in this vacuum, from the mists of the Carpathians and the marshes of the Dnieper, a new force emerged, not with bloodshed, but with birth rates. The Slavs began to move. What happened next wasn't just a migration. It was a demographic earthquake, a reshaping of Europe's very population. From humble forest settlements and riverside villages, the Slavic-speaking peoples expanded in every direction: north into the Baltic, west into Bohemia and beyond the Elbe, east into the shadow of the Urals, and south, deep into the Balkans. But what truly sets this movement apart in history is that it left more traces in DNA than in stone. When scientists analyzed ancient remains from the Balkans dated before 600 CE, they found almost no genetic connection to Eastern Europe. But after 600, everything changes. Skeletons from Serbia, Croatia, and Bulgaria suddenly light up with Slavic genetic markers. In some cases, over half the modern population's ancestry in these regions can be traced to those newcomers. That's not a rumor. That's genomic proof of a transformation so massive. It's like watching an entire landscape shift in fast motion. But this was no clean sweep. The Slavic expansion was not a conquest, it was a merger, a genetic blending. When the Slavs poured into the Balkans, they didn't eliminate the native peoples. They absorbed them. Illyrians, Thracians, Romanized locals, all folded into the Slavic wave. The evidence is right there in the Y chromosomes. Ancient Balkan haplogroups like I2ADN and EV13, once local, now flourish inside the South Slavic gene pool. That's the paradox of the Slavic explosion. It was vast, but not imperial. It was swift, but not brutal. And yet, it left a stronger genetic footprint than many actual empires ever did. In Central Europe, a similar pattern unfolds. Westward Slavic groups reached lands occupied by Germanic tribes and Celtic remnants. They settled, intermarried, and passed on their languages. The genetic boundaries blurred, but the Slavic core persisted. Haplogroups like R1A M458 spread like wildfire, mixing but not vanishing. And in the east, the Slavs filled a void. Much of what is now Western Russia was sparsely populated at the time. Here, the Slavic expansion wasn't replacement. It was occupation of new frontiers. But even in these virgin forests, they met others. The Uralic tribes of the north left their mark in DNA through haplogroups like NM231, blending into northern Russian genomes. What made this expansion so successful wasn't warfare. It was fertility, adaptability, and proximity to others. Slavic villages weren't militarized outposts. They were family machines, tightly knit communities with deep cultural cohesion. That kind of structure sustains growth over generations, especially when paired with high survivability and isolation. It's why today, Slavic ancestry stretches across 2 continents, binding together people who no longer share kingdoms, or even religions, but who share a deeper truth, a common origin that pulsed outward like a ripple in a lake. Every wave of this expansion left genetic layers, in Slavic men carrying ancient paternal signatures, in mothers whose mitochondrial DNA tells of ancient Balkan, Uralic, and Baltic women, and in children who bore both the language of the newcomers and the DNA of the locals. By the end of the first millennium, the Slavs were no longer a migration. They were a continent-wide presence. From the icy lakes of Finland to the Adriatic coast, their descendants carried something extraordinary. Not just language, but legacy. A legacy forged not by emperors, but by expansion so vast, it left an imprint in the human genome itself. This was not the march of a military. It was the quiet colonization of DNA. Slavic isn't one thing. It never was. Beneath the surface of one of Europe's largest language families lies a more intricate mosaic of ancestries, adaptations, and hidden threads woven over centuries. The name might be shared, the linguistic roots common, but the genetic signatures tell 3 different stories. Imagine a map not divided by politics or language, but by ancestry. Look closely, and you'll begin to see the pattern. In the West, a blend of Eastern memory and Western influence. In the East, an ancient core, undiluted and deeply cohesive. And in the South, a living palimpsest, Slavic, yes, but layered with civilizations that rose and fell before the Slavs ever arrived. The West Slavs, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, stand on the frontier between 2 worlds. Genetically, they carry the hallmarks of the Slavic expansions, but with them comes something else. Signals of Celtic tribes, Germanic ancestors, and prehistoric Central Europeans. Their Y chromosome shows elevated levels of R1A, especially the unique branch known as L260, a variant found rarely elsewhere. But next to it, another lineage appears, R1B, more typical of Western Europe. This isn't contradiction, it's history. These are the descendants of those who didn't just spread, but stayed, adapted, and absorbed what they met. Further east, a different picture emerges. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, the East Slavs, carry something more cohesive. Their genome draws a line back to early medieval heartlands with remarkable continuity. Population geneticists often refer to this as a genomic plateau, a kind of stabilized identity, born from a strong founder population and only modestly touched by outsiders. R1A is still dominant, but its subclades here trace slightly different routes. Markers like Z282, deep-rooted in the soils of the forest steppe. And yet, even in this genetic bastion, surprises hide. Northern Russians, for instance, carry whispers of ancient Uralic bloodlines. Haplogroup NM231, of Siberian origin, pulses faintly among them, a legacy of long-forgotten exchanges with Finnic tribes in the northern frontier. Then there are the South Slavs, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Montenegrins, Bulgarians, a constellation of peoples linked by language but separated by everything else. Their genomes read like archaeological sites, layer upon layer of forgotten encounters. Here, the Slavic imprint is undeniable, but it's joined by threads far older. The Balkans were already old when the Slavs arrived, populated by Illyrians, Thracians, Greeks, and Roman settlers. The Slavs who settled here didn't erase those histories. They intertwined with them. That's why South Slavs show a significantly higher frequency of lineages, like I2ADN, a marker rooted in the Western Balkans before Slavic speech was ever heard. What's striking is not just how different these groups are, but how clearly their paths show in DNA. Genetic clustering analyses confirm this tripartite structure. When plotted, West Slavs gravitate toward Central Europeans, East Slavs form a tight core, and South Slavs stretch toward the Mediterranean, clustering with Balkan and even Hellenic populations. They are all Slavs, but they are not the same. Even their maternal lineages diverge subtly. Certain mitochondrial haplogroups, like U5A2 or H5A1, are disproportionately common in East and West Slavs, suggesting ancient maternal continuity. In contrast, South Slavic regions exhibit broader maternal diversity, evidence of the fusion between newcomers and ancient Balkan lineages. But perhaps the most poetic evidence of these three faces isn't in haplogroups or autosomal segments. It's in the very geographic logic of genetics. Move from Warsaw to Kiev, and you feel the genome sharpen, the identity narrow. Shift from Kiev to Sarajevo, and it opens again, like a book that's already been read, then overwritten. This is the living geography of blood. And yet, despite all these differences, there is still unity. The Slavic world is not a singular genome. It is a network of related legacies, all born from a shared beginning, but molded by their paths outward. Like rivers flowing from one source, some turned east, some west, others south, but they all carry something of the same mountain spring. This is what makes Slavic DNA not just unique, but layered, fractal, and alive. Hidden in the northern mists of Russia, where the forests grow dark and the rivers freeze early, lies a whisper in the Slavic genome that doesn't speak Slavic at all. It's older, stranger, and nearly forgotten. It doesn't shout like the steppe bloodlines of Indo-European conquerors. It hums, faint, persistent, like the echo of a language long swallowed by silence. This is the Uralic thread, and it runs through the DNA of millions who have never heard the names of the people they carry within them. Northern Russians, not just Slavs in geography, but in blood? Not entirely. For centuries, the lands of Novgorod, Arkhangelsk, and the White Sea coast were sparsely inhabited by ancient Finno-Ugric peoples, tribes whose names faded before alphabets ever reached them. They fished, they hunted, and they sang in languages now vanished or barely remembered. They left behind almost no monuments, but they left behind something stronger, haplogroup N. This Y-chromosomal lineage, NM231, doesn't come from the heart of Europe. It drifts from the Arctic, from the ancient expanses of Siberia. It's the paternal marker of Uralic-speaking groups, the Finns, the Karelians, the Nenets. And somehow, silently, it entered the Slavic bloodstream. Genetic studies have found that in northern Russia, up to 20% of men carry this Uralic haplogroup. In some isolated regions, The figure climbs even higher, but south of Moscow it vanishes, as if the line had been drawn by the glaciers themselves. The deeper one goes into the northern taiga, the clearer this second heritage becomes. But how did it get there? The Slavic expansion, powerful as it was, did not overwrite every land it touched. In the north, it encountered something too remote to replace: small Uralic populations that had survived alone for millennia. Instead of displacement, there was intermingling. Slavic settlers took local wives. Uralic men became part of the new villages. Over time, languages faded, but genes endured. It's not just paternal markers. The autosomal DNA of northern Russians carries detectable Siberian-like ancestry, traces of a deeper, older Eurasia. This is not the legacy of recent migrations, but of an ancient intimacy, the kind that happens when two peoples live side by side for centuries, trading not just goods, but bloodlines. Even in the mitochondrial DNA, the maternal story, the signs are there. Certain lineages typical of Uralic populations appear more frequently in the north than anywhere else in the Slavic world. It's subtle, it's scattered, but it's real. And the influence isn't only genetic. Some of the oldest dialects of northern Russia show lexical and phonetic borrowings that have no roots in Indo-European languages. Place names, river names, ancient forest terms, they whisper back to non-Slavic origins, to hunters who once spoke a different tongue beneath the same stars. Yet today, few Russians, if any, think of themselves as having Uralic ancestry. It's a forgotten chapter, quietly folded into the national narrative. And that's what makes it so haunting, because part of what makes the Slavic genome so distinct in the East, so different from that of Poles or Slovenians, is this northern inheritance. It's not dominant, it's not obvious, but like veins of quartz in a slab of granite, it gives the Slavic identity in Russia a different texture, one that sets it apart from its Western cousins. And perhaps that's the real story here, that beneath the grand narratives of migration and empire, there are quieter forces shaping who we are. Peoples who never wrote down their names, still writing themselves into our code. Inside the human body, there are stories that whisper rather than shout. They're not told in battles or migration trails. They're told in broken strands of DNA, in single-letter errors passed from one generation to the next. Errors that once might have meant extinction, but instead became a kind of inheritance. Across the Slavic world, scattered through its millions, is a strange kind of unity. Mutations shared not by chance, but by bloodline. These aren't myths. They're traceable, predictable, recurrent. They are scars, written into the genome. One of the most famous is a tiny deletion, just 5 base pairs, in a gene known as NBN. Its full name doesn't matter to most. What matters is what it does. It disrupts DNA repair, and when inherited from both parents, it leads to a devastating condition known as Nijmegen breakage syndrome. Carriers are often unaware, but when two come together, the past catches up. And this particular mutation is so strongly linked to Slavic ancestry that scientists often call it the Slavic deletion. It likely arose thousands of years ago, in a founding population that grew faster than mutation could filter itself out. But it doesn't end there. In the realm of hereditary cancers, there's another ghost. A single duplication in the BRCA1 gene, known as 5382NC, shows up again and again in women from Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia, Ukraine. This mutation increases the risk of breast and ovarian cancers dramatically. And once again, its spread is not global. It's regional. It is pan-Slavic. What's happening here is more than chance. These are founder effects, genetic bottlenecks, where a small population carries a rare mutation and then multiplies rapidly. Over time, that mutation becomes statistically common within that population, even as it remains nearly absent elsewhere. It's not a reflection of weakness. It's a memory of origin. In the case of Wilson's disease, caused by mutations in the ADP7B gene that disrupt copper metabolism, Slavic populations again show a familiar pattern. A specific variant, his 1069GLN, is dominant among patients in Central and Eastern Europe. In Poland, it's found in over 70% of cases. But move westward, and its frequency drops sharply. The distribution map of this mutation could double as a rough sketch of Slavic migration routes. Other conditions follow the same script. Mutations in CFTR, associated with cystic fibrosis, cluster in distinct Slavic subpopulations. Rare variants in genes like PAH, responsible for phenylketonuria, show regional hot zones across Slavic countries. Even certain forms of Tay-Sachs disease, often linked with Jewish populations, have Slavic-specific alleles. These aren't isolated facts. Together, they build a genetic fingerprint, not of ancestry, but of shared biological vulnerability. A hidden thread that ties together people who may speak different dialects, live under different governments, or even worship differently, but whose cells remember the same beginning. And while these inherited wounds bring risk, they also bring clarity. For geneticists, Slavic populations offer something rare, a semi-cohesive, semi-isolated group large enough to reveal patterns, but still connected enough to matter. In countries like Poland, Russia, and Ukraine, studies of these mutations have helped develop better screening tools. Physicians now routinely test for founder mutations in certain cancers, accelerating early detection and treatment. What began as a genetic liability is now becoming an asset, a window into precision medicine. But even beyond science, there's something haunting in the idea that every Slavic life today carries within it the fingerprints of those who came before, not only their strength and survival, but their fragilities, their silent risks, their genetic grief. And perhaps that's what makes this story so human, because to be part of a lineage doesn't just mean inheriting triumph. It means carrying everything, broken parts, dangerous parts, forgotten parts, and somehow continuing anyway. Some stories written in our DNA are quiet. Others stand tall. In the limestone valleys of the Western Balkans, between the peaks of Herzegovina and the silent lakes of Montenegro, lives one of the world's strangest biological marvels. It doesn't speak a language. It doesn't wave a flag. But it rises above the crowd, in every village, every schoolyard, every generation. Here, in this narrow stretch of land, the men are among the tallest on Earth. Not just slightly above average. Not just one or two genetic outliers. Entire towns of boys grow into men who routinely cross 185 to 190 centimeters. In some places, the average is higher than in the Netherlands, long thought to be the global apex of human height. But why here? Why the Dinaric Alps? To find the answer, we have to look deeper than diet, deeper than environment. We have to go into the chromosome map of South Slavic men and trace a thread that runs straight through their ancient fathers. That thread is called haplogroup I2. Specifically, a sublineage known as I2A-DIN, also labeled IM170, which reaches extraordinary frequencies in Bosnia, Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia. In some regions of Herzegovina, over 70% of men carry this single paternal signature. It is not just a lineage. It is a biological amplifier. Scientific studies comparing average male height across Europe found a stunning correlation. Wherever I2A-DIN is most concentrated, average height soars. Not moderately, dramatically. In regions where Middle Eastern-derived haplogroups like J or E dominate, the average shrinks. But in the Dinaric zone, the genetic cards are stacked for stature. This is not a coincidence. It is a founder effect with a visible consequence. Sometime during the early medieval migrations, a group of South Slavic settlers entered the Balkans. Among them was a cluster of men carrying I2A-DIN, likely originating in earlier Balkan populations. These men and their sons thrived in the mountain terrain, forming tight-knit communities where this rare lineage became dominant. Generation after generation, the genetic variant associated with height passed on, unchecked and unchallenged. But I2A isn't a gene for height. It's a carrier, a marker that travels with the real culprits, a cluster of autosomal variants spread through the local genome that interact with growth hormones, bone density, and body proportions. What the Y chromosome does is reveal where these variants flourish together, and in the Dinaric zone, they align perfectly. Yet despite this, the Dinaric phenotype was long overlooked, in part because the region was isolated, rural, mountainous, politically unstable. It wasn't until recent military recruit data and anthropometric surveys began to stack up that researchers noticed something unusual was happening here. What they found wasn't just tall people. It was the tallest regional male average on the planet. And still, this is not just about numbers. It's about legacy. Because the same genetic isolation that preserved height in the Dinaric Slavs also preserved language, memory, and cultural fragments that stretch far into the past. These aren't just towering figures in sports arenas. These are the living echoes of a migration that happened 1,400 years ago, when Slavic settlers didn't just adopt a land, they inherited its biology. And now, that inheritance is measured not only in surnames or dialects, but in centimeters. In a world where most genetic traits hide deep within, this one stands above the rest, literally visible in every photo, every family gathering, every generation of sons taller than their fathers. It is a reminder that sometimes the past doesn't just live inside us. It walks beside us, one head taller,